All right, let's dive into something pretty wild. Have you ever wondered if the United States is mentioned in the Bible? It's a huge question, and today we're going to unpack a really specific, really intricate interpretation that claims the answer is a resounding yes. We're not just talking about vague clues, we're talking about a belief system that connects specific biblical verses to the US dollar bill, to the 50 states, even to global politics. We're going to break down the arguments piece by piece, so let's get right into it. So right off the bat, the core question here is simple, but the answer, well, it's anything but. Where is the United States in the Bible? I mean, you've got this global superpower, right? If the Bible has prophecies for the end times, you'd think it would get a mention. Well, the source we're digging into today doesn't just suggest it's there. It argues that the U.S. is absolutely central to a divine plan that's been unfolding for thousands of years. Okay, so what's the big idea? What's the thesis here? Get this. The claim is that the United States and Great Britain are the prophesied descendants of Abraham, specifically that they are the modern-day inheritors of the ancient Israelite tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's sons. According to this view, these two nations aren't just powerful by chance. Their rise to global dominance is the direct fulfillment of a biblical destiny promised centuries and centuries ago. So how in the world do they build this case? Well, we're going to follow their roadmap. First, we'll look at this whole idea of a prophetic identity. Then we'll get into some serious geopolitics, this idea of possessing the world's gates. After that, things get really symbolic, with a deep dive into the crossing of the Jordan River. And you're going to want to stick around for this next part because we're going to try and decode the Great Seal on the $1 bill. Seriously. Then we'll wrap up with some fascinating number crunching about the 50 states before pulling it all together with one final big picture question. All right, first up, a prophetic identity. This is really the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about. The whole argument hinges on the idea that the so-called lost tribes of Israel didn't just disappear. They migrated, they evolved, and they eventually grew into some of the most powerful nations we see today. And this interpretation gets really specific. It zeroes in on two of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. The argument goes like this. A biblical prophecy about a company of nations, or a commonwealth, that's seen as the British Commonwealth, which they identify as Ephraim. And that other prophecy, the one about a single great people, well, that's linked directly to the United States, seen as Manasseh. This lineage, this specific connection, is the key that supposedly unlocks everything else. Okay. So with that identity established, let's look at the first major piece of evidence they present. We're shifting from ancient lineage to modern-day geopolitics, and it all centers on a really specific promise from the book of Genesis. Here it is, Genesis 22:17, your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies. This single verse is absolutely crucial to the whole argument. It's a promise made to Abraham, and the source we're looking at sees it as a primary way to identify his descendants in the modern world. But it all hinges on how you define one single word. Gates. So what does gates mean in the 21st century? And this is where things get really interesting. The claim is that this prophecy isn't talking about ancient walled cities. I mean, that's not how power works anymore, right? In today's world, the gates of your enemies are the strategic choke points of global power. We're talking about the sea lanes, the canals, the straits, the places that control the flow of all international trade and military power. So then they lay out the evidence. Take a look at this list of critical gates. You've got Gibraltar, controlling access to the Mediterranean, the Panama Canal, connecting the two biggest oceans, the Suez Canal, the shortcut between Europe and Asia, the English Channel, the Straits of Malacca, a key shipping lane, the Bering Strait, even politically hotspots like Taiwan and the Falkland Islands. The argument is that if you look at who has historically controlled or heavily influenced these locations, you see a pattern. It's Great Britain and the United States. This isn't just a coincidence, they argue, it's tangible proof. So what does that all mean? It means that, from this perspective, the incredible geopolitical and economic power held by these nations isn't just some historical accident. It's the literal fulfillment of Genesis 22:17. By holding the keys to global commerce, they can basically set the rules of the game and maintain their power, a level of influence the source claims that could only be possible with a prophetic destiny behind it. Okay, let's pivot. We're moving from modern geography back to a deeply symbolic story from the Bible. The argument here is that the founding of America wasn't just a political event. No, it was a spiritual reenactment, a replay of the Israelites entering their promised land. This whole analogy is built around that dramatic story from the book of Joshua. You know, the one where the Israelites finally cross the Jordan River. So just like they crossed a physical river to claim their inheritance, the early American settlers are seen as having crossed their own river, the Atlantic Ocean, to establish a new nation, a promised land of refuge. And the key player in this whole symbolic drama? The Ark of the Covenant. And check this out, because a very specific detail from Joshua chapter 3 is interpreted in a really unique way. The text says the people had to stay about 2,000 cubits away from the ark. Now, a cubit is a measure of distance, sure, but the source argues that sometimes in the Bible, distance can represent time. Think of the prophetic year concept. So these 2,000 cubits of distance are reinterpreted to mean 2,000 years of time. And just like that, you get this really fascinating and, pretty unconventional prophetic timeline. The Ark of the Covenant, which in this view represents the spiritual presence of Jesus Christ, crosses its river, the river of death, through his death and resurrection somewhere around 34 AD. Then, the people, the future nation of refuge, have to follow, but only after that prophesied delay of 2,000 cubits, which is interpreted as roughly 2,000 years. And where does that land us? Right in the modern era, with the founding of the United States, which is seen as the people finally crossing into their promised land. But the symbolism doesn't stop there. The story continues with Joshua telling 12 men to grab 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River and set them up as a memorial. In this interpretation, that pile of stones isn't just a memory of something that happened. It's seen as a prophetic marker for the future creation of a new great empire, the United States, formed directly in the symbolic shadow of the ark. Okay, now we're getting into what is, for me, maybe the most visually detailed and frankly startling claim in this entire framework. We're going to look at something you've probably seen 1,000 times and never thought much about: the back of the U.S. $1 bill. So here's the question the source asks. Could the Great Seal of the United States, that pyramid with the eye floating above it, actually be a hidden depiction of the Ark of the Covenant? The idea is that this familiar symbol isn't Masonic or Egyptian in origin, but biblical, showing the Ark as it looked when it was prepared for travel. So how could a golden box possibly look like a stone pyramid? Well, the argument comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 4, which gives these super specific instructions for how to move the ark. Let's walk through it. Step 1. The thick temple veil was draped over the ark. This would have filled in the space between the cherubim's wings, immediately creating a sloped, almost pyramid-like shape. Step 2. A tough covering of animal skins, maybe badger or camel skins, was placed over that. This would give it a rough, earthy texture and color, something that could easily look like stone from a distance. And finally, the long carrying poles were put through the rings at the bottom, which would have made the base wider and really locked in that classic pyramid shape. And then comes the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. A cloth of pure blue was laid over the very top of everything. According to this view, that blue cloth acted like a visual separator, like a patch of sky, between the earthy pyramid-shaped base and the glorious cloud of God's presence that was said to hover above the ark's mercy seat. When you picture that, it creates this incredible effect of a floating, detached capstone, the all-seeing eye. But wait, it goes even deeper. The symbolism doesn't just stop with the picture. The source also tries to decode the Roman numerals for 1776, MDCCLXXVI, right at the base of the pyramid. Now, this is a really complex linguistic argument, so bear with me. The claim is that if you read the Latin letters out loud, phonetically, MDCCLXXVI, you get a string of sounds. The source then takes those sounds and transliterates them into Hebrew letters. And from the Hebrew roots of those letters, it claims to find a hidden sentence, MDCCLXXVI, which is then translated as, "Mother, know how God is my covering," or my throne. All right, for our last major piece of evidence, we're heading back to that Jordan River story one more time, because the argument here is that the story doesn't just give us a founding analogy for the U.S. It supposedly contains a precise numerological key that predicts the exact number of states in the Union, all 50 of them. So here's how the math supposedly works. The source breaks down the key elements from the story and gives each one a symbolic number. First, you've got the Ark and its priests. That's said to represent the 13 original colonies. Then you add Joshua, the leader, that's 1. Then there were the 12 stones placed in the river, and the 12 men chosen to carry them. And finally, another 12 stones taken from the river to the camp. So, you add it all up. 13 plus 1 plus 12 plus 12 plus 12, and what do you get? Exactly 50. And it gets even more detailed. The source tries to map these numbers onto the actual historical expansion of the United States in a specific order. So the first 25, that's the 13 colonies, plus that first set of 12 stones, are said to represent the states formed from the territory Britain gave up in 1783. The next group of 12, the stones for the camp, supposedly represent the states that were eventually created from the massive Louisiana Purchase from France. And that final group of 12 men, well, that represents all the remaining states that came after, completing the 50-state union we have today. So when you step back and look at the whole thing, you can see it's a really complex tapestry, right? It weaves together all these different threads. You've got geopolitics with the control of the world's gates. You've got history with the symbolic retelling of the Jordan River crossing. You've got visual symbolism with the deep dive into the Great Seal. And you've got numerology with this calculation of the 50 states. All of it comes together to form this single, cohesive, and definitely unconventional prophetic story for the United States. And that brings us to the big takeaway question here. Whether you accept the specific interpretation or not, it really pushes us to think about a broader idea. How much do these ancient symbols, these foundational stories, and this constant search for meaning in our own history, how much does all that continue to shape a nation's identity, its sense of purpose on the world stage? It's a pretty powerful reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from really, really matter. Thanks for digging into this with us today.